The highway leading out of Austin, Texas, stretches endlessly under a vast, indifferent sky. In the summer of 1997, this road became a path of no return for one young woman. Colleen Reed was a 29-year-old Austin resident, known for her bright smile and a gentle spirit. On the night of August 18th, she was closing up the business she managed at a local laundromat. After locking up, she stopped at a nearby convenience store to buy a soft drink. The store clerk would be one of the last people to see her alive, a detail he'd never forget. As she drove away into the warm Texas night, an unseen predator was already watching. Just a few miles down the road, Colleen's car would be found, abandoned and silent. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, just her personal belongings left behind. For her family, a nightmare began, a desperate wait for any news that never seemed to come. The police investigation hit wall after wall. Leads dried up like the Texas summer heat. Unbeknownst to them, Colleen was not this predator's first victim, and she wouldn't be his last. A year and a half later, in the spring of 1999, a young woman named Jessica Cain vanished. She was on her way home from a restaurant where she worked as a hostess in Houston. Like Colleen, she simply disappeared. Her car was later found abandoned on a remote highway. 2 women, 2 cars, 2 empty highways. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Investigators from different jurisdictions began to share notes, realizing they were hunting the same ghost. They were looking for a predator who hunted on the highways, a phantom who struck and then vanished. The case went cold for nearly 2 decades, a source of endless pain for the families. Then, in 2015, a cold case detective named Sergeant Brian decided to take one last look. Sergeant Brian wasn't looking for a confession. He was looking for a ghost, a trace of evidence missed by the naked eye. He sent the old evidence, including a blanket found near Colleen's car, to a modern crime lab. There, a forensic specialist named Laura would apply new DNA technology that didn't exist in 1997. For weeks, Laura worked silently, comparing the genetic profiles to databases of known offenders. And then a match. A name from the past popped up on the screen, a name that made her blood run cold. William Reece, a convicted kidnapper from Oklahoma with a history of violence against women. In 1997, he was working as a traveling oil field hand, drifting through Texas, living in his truck. The pattern was undeniable. His work took him along the very highways where the women had vanished. But Laura's analysis didn't stop there. The DNA on the blanket was a match, a solid link to Colleen Reed. Armed with this new evidence, Sergeant Brian traveled to an Oklahoma prison to finally meet his ghost. The man who walked into the interview room was older now, gray-haired.
Tell me what happened that
held
night.
The same
I wasn't there, I told
emptiness.
you. We have witnesses.
Brian
Talk.
placed
All right,
the
I saw
DNA
something.
report on the table. "We have you, Bill," he said. "For Colleen Reed." Reece looked at the paper, then back at Brian. For a long moment, the room was completely silent. Then he spoke. Not a confession for Colleen, but a question that would open a door to a much darker truth. "What about that girl over in Houston? The one from the restaurant?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. In that single sentence, Reece connected himself to another missing woman, a case that had haunted Houston for years. Over the course of a long, grueling interrogation, the dam finally began to break. Reece confessed to abducting and murdering both Colleen Reed and Jessica Cain. He led them to remote, overgrown fields that would forever be known as the Texas Killing Fields. There, in the dense brush, hidden for nearly 2 decades, the remains of the young women were finally found. For the families, the news brought a devastating mix of grief and relief. The waiting was finally over, but for Sergeant Brian, a chilling question remained. Were there more? He returned to Reece, armed with maps, timelines, and a list of every unsolved disappearance along his work routes. One name kept appearing, a ghost from 1997 that fit the pattern perfectly: Laura Smither. Laura was just 12 years old when she vanished from her suburban neighborhood in Friendswood, Texas. She had gone for a jog one Saturday morning in April 1997, just months before Colleen was taken. Her body was found weeks later in a retention pond, but her killer had never been caught. Brian placed Laura's school photo on the table in front of Reece. "Do you remember her?" he asked quietly. Reece stared at the photo for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then he nodded. He confessed to taking Laura too, describing how he had seen her jogging and made a split-second decision. The confession for Laura led investigators back to the killing fields to search a new section they had missed. There, hidden beneath decades of growth, they found remains that would be identified as Laura Smither. The news shattered another family and cemented Reece's status as one of Texas's most prolific serial killers. But even with 3 confessions, Brian felt the story was incomplete. The gaps in Reece's timeline were too large. He dug deeper into Reece's past, uncovering a history of violence that stretched back to his teenage years. In 1976, a young woman named Marilee Brusser vanished from a convenience store in Oklahoma, not far from Reece's hometown. Her body was found months later in a remote area. The case had gone unsolved for over 40 years. Brian brought the old case file to Reece. "Oklahoma, 1976, he said. "Tell me about Marilee." For the first time, Reece seemed to hesitate, as if facing a ghost from the very beginning of his dark path. But after a long silence, he began to talk, adding Marilee Brusser's name to his growing list of victims. With 4 confessions on tape, the full picture of William Reece began to emerge, a predator who had evaded justice for over 40 years. Investigators traced his movements across the American Southwest, a dark journey tied to the oil fields where he worked. Each new job site brought him to new highways, new towns, and new opportunities to hunt. In 1986, a young woman named Suzanne Sue Poole disappeared from a convenience store in Galveston County. She was just 17 years old, a teenager with her whole life ahead of her, until she crossed paths with William Reece. Her body was found days later in a ditch, but her killer remained a mystery for over 30 years. When Brian placed Sue's photo on the table, Reece didn't flinch. He simply nodded, as if recalling an old memory. "I remember her," he said quietly. "She was near the water." And another confession began. He led authorities to a remote location in Galveston County, where new searches would finally bring Sue home. For the Poole family, the call from Texas brought decades of waiting to a heartbreaking end. But the revelations didn't stop there. Forensic specialists like Laura were finding connections no one had seen before. Old evidence from cases across 3 states was re-examined, and Reece's DNA kept appearing. Victim by victim, the scope of his crimes grew. What began as one missing woman became a killing spree spanning generations. Prosecutors now faced the challenge of building cases on confessions given decades after the crimes were committed. But Reece's own words, captured on tape, were the most powerful weapon they had. In 2018, William Reece was extradited to Texas to face justice for the murders of Laura Smither and Jessica Cain. He appeared in court, a frail-looking old man who bore little resemblance to the predator who had terrorized Texas highways. But the families who packed the courtroom knew the truth. They had stared into the face of evil for decades. One by one, they stood to deliver victim impact statements, giving voice to the pain that had haunted them for so long. "You took my daughter," her mother said, her voice breaking but unwavering. "But you will not take my voice." In March 2018, William Reece stood before a judge and pleaded guilty to the murders of Laura Smither and Jessica Cain. As part of the plea agreement, he received 2 life sentences, ensuring he would die in prison. But for the families of Colleen Reed and the others, the fight for justice was not yet over. Reece still needed to face charges for the murders in Galveston County and for the decades-old killing in Oklahoma. In October 2018, he was transported back to Oklahoma to answer for the murder of Marilee Brusser in 1976. For Marilee's family, the journey to this day had lasted more than 4 decades, a lifetime of unanswered questions. In the Oklahoma courtroom, Reece again confessed, his voice flat and emotionless as he described taking Marilee's life. He was sentenced to life in prison, a punishment that felt hollow to those who had waited so long for answers. With the Oklahoma case closed, authorities turned their full attention to the final piece of the puzzle, Suzanne Poole. In 2019, William Reece was brought to Galveston County to face his final judgment for the murder of the 17-year-old. The courtroom was packed with those who had followed his trail of destruction for decades. Suzanne's sister, now a woman in her 50s, prepared to face the man who had stolen her sibling so long ago. When Reece entered the courtroom in his orange jumpsuit, she did not look away. She stared directly into his eyes. Reece pleaded guilty once more, adding Suzanne Poole's name to the official record of his crimes. The judge sentenced him to yet another life term, a formality for a man already condemned to die behind bars. Outside the courthouse, Suzanne's sister finally spoke the words she had carried for a lifetime. "My sister was 17. She never got to graduate, never got to fall in love, never got to grow old," she said. "But today, the world finally knows her name. Today, we brought her home." With the final confession secured, the investigators could at last close the files on a 40-year nightmare. But for the families, the story would never truly end. They would carry the loss with them forever. In total, William Reece confessed to 5 murders, though investigators believe the true number may never be known. He was a drifter, a ghost who moved through the shadows of the American highway, leaving devastation in his wake. For the detectives who pursued him, the case became the defining mission of their careers, a quest for justice that spanned decades. Laura, the forensic scientist, continued her work, knowing that somewhere in a cold case file, another victim was waiting to be identified. The families of the victims found strength in one another, forming bonds forged in shared grief and shared justice. They created a foundation to help other families of missing persons, turning their pain into a purpose. Every year, they gather at the killing fields to remember the women who were taken, ensuring they are never forgotten. One by one, they release the balloons, watching them rise toward the sky, carrying their love with them. For the families of Colleen Reed, the journey was the longest. Her remains were the last to be found. But in 2021, searchers returned to the killing fields one last time, following a new tip from Reece's old memories. There, beneath the roots of an ancient oak tree, they found what they had been seeking for 24 years. Colleen Reed was finally found. Her remains were recovered and returned to the family who had never stopped loving her. Her funeral was held on a bright Texas morning, 24 years after she had vanished into the night. The pastor spoke of a life cut short, but a legacy of love that would endure forever. As they lowered her casket into the ground, a gentle breeze swept through the cemetery, as if the earth itself was sighing with relief. Sergeant Brian stood at the back, watching. He had kept his promise. He had brought Colleen home. The case of the Texas killing fields was officially closed, but its memory would never fade from those who lived through it. Today, the highways of Texas are still busy, still stretching endlessly under that vast, indifferent sky. But for those who know the story, those roads will always carry a whisper, a reminder of the women who never made it home. Their names were Colleen, Jessica, Laura, Marilee, and Suzanne. And though their lives were stolen, their voices will echo forever.